God, do I even remember how to do this? What's happening, everybody? Justin, Bridgewater's finest on YouTube, Blockbuster_guy on Twitter, fueled as always by the great folks at NerdTees, and welcome to the 2018-2019 NHL Playoffs predictions. As you can see, I'm very clearly decked out in the gear of the teams that I cheer for, although after the game in Anaheim last night, I'm not sure anymore. But I've been jonesing. I've had that itch to get back on here, talk a little puck. And what we're going to be doing in the next two videos is this video, as well as the next one that's going to come out later today. Or if it's in the future, it's probably already out now. You should go watch that one after you're done watching this one. What we're going to do is we're going to be predicting the Eastern and Western Conference playoff pictures, where everybody's got about 14 to 15 games left to go, still plenty to be decided. Unless, of course, you're a fan of the Tampa Bay Lightning, because they've already clinched. So in this video, we're going to look specifically at the Eastern Conference, the Metropolitan Division and the Atlantic Division, basically identifying the three teams that I think are going to win out into playoff spots in those divisions, and then also looking at the wildcard picture. And stay tuned to the end of the Western Conference video, because I've got a little extra added treat for you. So without further ado, let's get started. We're going to start with the Metropolitan Division, basically because that's the division that's more interesting. The Atlantic Division, honestly, it's pretty well already spoken for. Division standings in the Met currently look like this. Washington leads things with 87 points. The Islanders right behind them with 85. Pittsburgh right behind them with 81. Fourth place, you got Carolina with 79 points. Columbus in fifth with 77. Then you've got Philadelphia, the New York Rangers, and New Jersey with 72, 66, and 59, respectively. Every team in this division has exactly 15 games remaining on their schedule, with the exception of first place Washington and last place New Jersey. They only have 14 games left. So the rest of this division has a game in hand on the team in the lead. So we might as well quickly get out of the way the two teams that are not in the playoff conversation whatsoever in the Met Division. Obviously talking about the Rangers and the Devils, only 66 and 59 points respectively here. I do think the Devils, though, do have the easier schedule the rest of the way home this season. They've got close to a half a dozen games here that I think they're actually going to win. I've got the Devils finishing with 73 points. That's a pretty good finish down the stretch, 14 points in 14 games. It would be a strong way for them to end the regular season. Those include quality wins against teams like Washington and Boston, who towards the end of the season feel like they're probably going to have less and less to play for. The Rangers, no slouches. I've got them finishing with 11 points down the stretch, obviously losing more than they're winning, but I do have the Rangers finishing with 77 points, just a few points ahead of Jersey. Now let's go to the top of this division. We've got three teams that are all within 6 points of each other in terms of trying to win this division. That's Washington, the Islanders, and Pittsburgh. Now, despite currently leading the division, I actually think Washington has the most difficult schedule moving forward for the rest of the season. And like I mentioned, everybody else has got a game in hand on them. The pivotal game here is the last game of the season, which means the schedule makers, they really did a great one here. Washington and the New York Islanders in Washington. I think that's the game that could decide the division. But both the Islanders and the Penguins, I legitimately think, have softer schedules the rest of the way here towards the end of the season. I think Washington's going to be really hard-pressed to keep that position on top of the division. I actually don't think they do it. Finishing the season with 107 points, my Metropolitan Division champion is the New York Islanders. I've got them collecting 22 points in their remaining 15 games. I've only got them losing 4 games for the rest of the season. 3 of those 4 games going to come on the road. They have to go to Montreal. I think they lose that game. To Philadelphia and to Winnipeg. I've got them losing those games. I've also got them losing on home ice against the Leafs. But the rest of their games, I honestly think they win the rest of their games. They have a really strong finish to the season. It's worth noting, I also think Pittsburgh collects 22 points in their remaining 15 games. That's not going to be enough for Pittsburgh to catch Washington, but it is going to be enough for the Islanders to catch Washington. So I think the Islanders win the Metropolitan Division. What a story that is off the heels of losing John Tavares to the aforementioned Leafs. I think the Islanders win this division. I've got Washington finishing second place in the Metropolitan Division, finishing with 105 points. And I've got the Pittsburgh Penguins finishing third in the Met Division with 103. The other three teams in the Met that we haven't talked about, Carolina, Columbus, and even Philadelphia, I'm going to save them a little bit because that's a wild card conversation that we have to have. And yes, it does include the Flyers. Moving over and taking a look at the Atlantic Division, like I say, I'm saving them for last because most everything in the Atlantic Division has been decided. The only real question I think that's left is, do the Montreal Canadiens make it as a wild card team? And that's because of the strength of the wild card competition in the Eastern Conference. You can basically look at those four teams at the bottom of the Atlantic. I don't really think they have much of a chance. Atlantic Division standings look like this. Tampa Bay, of course, out in front in that division, 106 points in 68 games. They are the only team, the first team and the only team thus far, who have clinched a playoff spot. Boston in 67 games has 91 points. The Leafs trail them by 4 points with 87. You've got Montreal in fourth place with 79 points, one of the surprises of the league this year. I understand that I'm a little bit biased in saying that, but I don't think I'm wrong. You got Florida in fifth place with 70 points. Buffalo in sixth place with 69. Nice. Seventh place, Detroit with 58. And the eighth place, Ottawa Senators, pulling up the rear in the Atlantic Division, just 52 points in 68 games. Boston, Toronto, Buffalo, and Detroit all have 15 games remaining on their schedule. Everyone else in the division has 14 games except the Montreal Canadiens only have 13 games remaining on their schedule, the fewest number of games in the entire Eastern Conference. So like I said, those four teams at the bottom of the Atlantic Division, I think we basically have to rule them out in terms of any kind of playoff conversation. I mean, Detroit and Ottawa, they're just bad hockey teams. They're just plain bad hockey teams. They might get half a dozen points respectively heading out here for the rest of the season. I've actually got Ottawa finishing with 59 points. I've got Detroit finishing with 65. It's just two bad seasons. They're both looking forward to the draft lottery. In that collection of teams, though, I do have to say, I do honestly think Buffalo is going to have a strong finish to the season. The majority of the rest of their home games, I think they're all winnable home games. Buffalo's problem is they can't win a game on the road to save their soul. If they could win a game or two on the road and could have done it consistently throughout the season, Buffalo would be in this wild card conversation. The problem is they have not been able to do that, and that's why they're not in the wild card conversation. But I do have Buffalo finishing strong, 17 points over their final 15 games. I've got them finishing with 86 points, which will be better than Florida. I've got Florida stumbling the rest of the way, only picking up 10 points in their remaining games. So I've got Buffalo finishing with 86. I've only got Florida finishing with 80. Going up to the top of the division, again, I think everything is basically spoken for. You've got the Tampa Bay Lightning. Nobody is catching them for the division. You might as well call it now. Tampa Bay wins the Atlantic Division. I've actually got them finishing with 127 points. I've only got them losing 3 games for the rest of the whole season. All 3 of those games are on the road against playoff teams at St. Louis, at Toronto, and at Boston. Those last 2 games come right at the end of the regular season when there will be absolutely nothing to play for, and Tampa Bay will be playing backups and third and fourth line, bottom 6 guys, resting their star players to make a deep playoff run. And that's more important, I think, for Tampa Bay than for virtually any other team in the NHL. With how dominant the Tampa Bay Lightning have been this season, you've been hearing it more and more lately, and the more you hear it, the more it really does sound true. If Tampa Bay does not win the Stanley Cup this year, what a lost season that this is. Like, this incredible regular season, it winds up meaning nothing because you played so well for 82 games, and then for the final 25 you couldn't get it done. And that's really where this season's going to lie, which is a ton of pressure for the Tampa Bay Lightning. It's either cup or bust. Boston and Toronto, of course, have been, kind of hopping back and forth, leapfrogging each other for second and third in this division for the majority of the season. Right now, again, Boston's got a 4-point edge. They both have 15 games remaining on their schedule. The question is, can Toronto catch them? I think if they were playing Freddie Anderson for the vast majority of the rest of their games this season, maybe they might have a shot at it. This Toronto team, obviously, very impressive hockey team, but they're not doing that. They've already mentioned that they're kind of putting Freddie Anderson on a pitch count for the rest of the season, which means it's basically going to be half Anderson, half Garrett Sparks. And if Garrett Sparks is playing half your games, you're not making up that 4-point edge. So playing Garrett Sparks that much is paramount to saying, look, the rest of the regular season doesn't matter. What matters is the playoffs. What matters is beating Boston in the first round. That's who we basically know that we're playing. So that's what matters, is that goaltender coming into that series as rested as possible. Because in that series last year, it's been talked about to death. He had a sub .900 save percentage in that series. Not good enough to beat the Bruins. He has to be better in that first round series. So I don't have Toronto catching them. I actually have Toronto and Boston basically exactly the same throughout the rest of the season. I've got Boston finishing with 110 points. I've got Toronto finishing with 106. So Tampa Bay wins the Atlantic Division. Boston comes second in the Atlantic Division. Toronto comes third. Boston and Toronto in the first round yet again. So now that we've established that I've got the Islanders and the Lightning winning the divisions, and Washington, Pittsburgh, and Boston, Toronto as first round playoff matchups as 2 versus 3s, now it's the wild card conversation, and this is a really interesting conversation to have. Like I talked about earlier, I included the Philadelphia Flyers in the wildcard conversation just because I think their schedule is really, really favorable down the stretch. They've got Carter Hart coming back. They've got Jakub Voracek coming back. I've got the Flyers collecting 18 points in their final 15 games. That includes a big win at Toronto. It includes a win at St. Louis, beating playoff bubble teams. They are going to lose some games here and there, but it is going to be kind of dependent on their ability to get games out of regulation, get games into overtime, grab some pity points if you don't, win the game outright. But I think the Flyers have a strong finish to the regular season. I've actually got them finishing with 90 points, and that's worth mentioning because it's in the conversation for a wild card. It's a great step forward, especially with Carter Hart between the pipes. Carolina and Columbus I'll talk about here together because both of these teams have that aforementioned 2 games in hand on the Montreal Canadiens in terms of the wild card conversation here in the Eastern Conference. They've both got 15 games left. Montreal's only got the 13. Carolina sits with 79 points right now. Columbus sits with 77. However, Columbus does have one extra regulation or overtime win, which is a very important stat in terms of tiebreakers. The schedules are about even. I don't see one as being significantly more difficult than the other. I look at the Columbus Blue Jackets and it so worries me, this discord between coach or management or both and their starting goaltender. Like Sergei Bobrovsky very clearly is out the door at the end of the season. There's no re-signing Bobrovsky. There's probably no re-signing Panarin, but there's definitely no re-signing Bobrovsky. And Eunice Korpisalo and Keith Kincaid are not going to take this team to the playoffs. It's going to be Bobrovsky or nobody. So either Bobrovsky and Torts and the management can get on the same page for the last 15 games of the season and haul this team into the playoffs, or they can't. And it's very difficult for me to go with a team that has such a discord there between a star player and the management. That said, I do have Columbus picking up 17 points in their remaining 15 games. I've got Carolina picking up 16 points in their remaining 15 games. I have the Carolina Hurricanes finishing with 95 points. I've got Columbus finishing with 94. And what that means is the Carolina Hurricanes will make the playoffs as an Eastern Conference wildcard team. So now we've got to boil down to this. Is it going to be the Montreal Canadiens or is it going to be the Columbus Blue Jackets? I've talked a little bit about Columbus. I'm really scared by that game last night in Anaheim for Montreal. Like, the fact that not only did Montreal give up 8 goals, but all 8 of them were on Carey Price, and that's terrifying, especially in a game where Price is trying to set the all-time Habs record for wins for a goaltender. To pass Jacques Plante rather than just being tied with him, it was an effort that absolutely boggled my mind. I don't know. I couldn't explain it. Whether it was the defense in front of him not giving him the opportunity or Carey just not making the save, that's worrying. Montreal also doesn't have the easiest schedule going forward. Again, they give up the games in hand, but every road game they have for the rest of the season is against a team that's either firmly entrenched in the playoffs or is a playoff bubble team. They're going to lose some of those games. They're going to lose a game or two here at home. It's a matter of the rest of the way Montreal has to beat every opponent that they should beat. They cannot afford to do what they did last night against Anaheim. They cannot afford to do that again. I have the Columbus Blue Jackets picking up 17 points in their remaining 15 games to finish the season with 94 points. I have the Montreal Canadiens picking up 16 points in their remaining 13 games to finish with 95. I'm going to take the Montreal Canadiens to get in as the number 2 wildcard team in the Eastern Conference. They would lose out on the number 1 wildcard spot by virtue of regulation and overtime wins, but I've got Montreal getting in as the second wildcard team again. They've been proving people wrong all season. I got to put my faith in the Bleu Blanc et Rouge, and I'm going to do that. I'm going to take Montreal to get in as that number 2 wildcard team in the East. So, based on my predictions, the first round of the Eastern Conference playoffs would look like this. The Atlantic Division champion Tampa Bay Lightning would draw a first-round matchup with the number 2 wildcard team, the Montreal Canadiens. In that series, I would take the Tampa Bay Lightning probably in 5 games. I think maybe Montreal gets one of those games off of them in the Bell Center, but I mean, Tampa Bay should win that series in a walk. The number 2 and number 3 matchup in the Atlantic Division would see the rematch of the Boston Bruins and the Toronto Maple Leafs. In that series, I'm very heavily considering taking the Leafs in 6 games. I will say this: if the Leafs are leading this series 3-2 and have game 6 on home ice, Leafs win the series. If this series gets to game 7, Boston's going to win the series. Toronto will not beat Boston, in my opinion, in a game 7 in Boston. But if they can win this thing, if they can close it out in 6 games, I think they do it. There's so many demons here. I think if they have an opportunity in game 6, those demons are exercised. If they don't, if it gets to a game 7, Boston's moving on. The Metropolitan Division champion New York Islanders would draw a first-round playoff matchup with the number 1 wildcard team in the East. That's the Carolina Hurricanes. In that series, I think I'd have to take the Islanders in 7. I think those 2 teams, obviously division rivals, very evenly matched. I think it gets to 7. I'll give the Islanders the edge with home ice. I'll take the Islanders in a full 7-gamer. And the Metropolitan 2-3 matchup of Washington playing host to Pittsburgh. I actually think that the Capitals close that one out pretty quickly. I'm giving it to Caps in 5. I think Pittsburgh wins one of those 2 games in Pittsburgh, but I think Washington goes undefeated at home in that series. I'm giving it to the Caps in 5. So there you go. Tampa, Boston, Toronto, 1-2-3 in the Atlantic. New York, Washington, Pittsburgh, 1-2-3 in the Met. We got Carolina as the wild card 1. We've got Montreal as the wild card 2. That's the way I see the Eastern Conference. What are your predictions for the remainder of the regular season? That's going to be it for me for this video. Justin, Bridgewater's Finest on YouTube, Blockbuster_guy on Twitter, fueled as always by the great folks at Nerd Tees. And right around the corner is the Western Conference predictions. See you in a minute.